Morning has broken like the first morning. Blackbird has spoken like the first bird. Praise for the singing, praise for the morning, praise for them springing fresh from the world. Sweet the rains.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a scholar of the law, tested him by asking, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments." The gospel of the Lord. When we hear this very short passage, we forget how profound it truly is. And that is, well, they were trying to test him, as it's been happening in the past weeks as Jesus is moving up to Jerusalem itself. And so the hostile opponents are trying to find ways in which he will say something that they can contradict or be in contrast with in what they hold and believe. And so asking him from, 600 and some of those laws that they have in the books, if you collected them all and found them, which of these are the greatest? Well, Jesus answers from the Bible itself and from the scriptures. He answers that it's to love God with all our heart and soul, mind, and being. The love of God, the most important thing. But then he couples it. And this is very interesting because we can say in words, "I love God, I love you, Lord," and then not do anything about it. And so by coupling it with what we do with our neighbor, allows us to really prove, indeed, what we say in word. And that is, if we really love our neighbor, we do things for them. We don't do hostile things, like was being done at that very time to him. And so when you look at it that way, loving the neighbor is not only a contrast to loving God, but it's really a coupling, a coming together of two commandments as though they're one, because one will prove the other. Loving our neighbor proves that we do have love of God if we say it. And loving God is shown in what we do to our neighbor. This is a very important aspect in the Christian life that some of us live, and life in general, is because it is necessary for us to love our neighbor, and some people do not. The question I ask when someone is coming into the church is, do you love your neighbor, or do you have a certain sense of hate for one or other person? Are there people that you don't reserve the right to love or to like in any fashion, and have cut them out of your life deliberately to where you would say, we hate them? As we sometimes hear during election years, people talking about hating others. This is a wrong thing to do, because then what we are doing is we're cutting the world into pieces. We may continue to love our family, or certain partners, or somebody else in the world, but then we say, no, that group over there, they're enemy, they're people that are distant from us, they are not my neighbor. The world is a lot smaller than it used to be. We know today that we can have an instant communication to someone on the other side of the planet. And this is something we can do because of modern communications and transportation, for that matter, where in transportation we can actually send food or goods, materials and services to people in other parts of the world. We are becoming one neighborhood, one people. Yes, we can now say a family of brothers and sisters and really mean it. Or we may not do it. We may deliberately, out of the freedom that is with each individual, we can use that and say, I will not love someone or other. Now, the Pope has recently written an encyclical called Fratelli Tutti. Strange words unless you're Italian, but still they are talking about really the different neighborhoods that we have in our world. He is actually trying to bring us to a social friendship with others, a fraternity, understanding that where all the people of the world have to be considered neighbors. And he actually uses the gospel passage on the Good Samaritan in his chapter 2 as the beginnings of what it is that we should do as individuals and as a people through dialogue, through connection, to make us a friendship that we need to have, the collaboration that is required if we're going to renew the face of the earth and actually get a renewal of economics to where everyone can live fairly and not there be some in tremendous privileged inequality and others destitute. In order for that to happen, we have to establish a friendship with people. And he speaks of his relationship to one of the Muslim leaders in the Middle East. And he speaks of him at the beginning and at the end as being a motivating force, together with that of the spirit of St. Francis of Assisi, whose tomb he actually promulgated the encyclical itself, and on that feast day of him. And so as we look at this, we say, oh, when we talk about neighbor, we have to think about this a lot more carefully than we've done in the past. It involves politics, and he says it does, in a good sense, because we have to be political in order to bring together people who are different in the ways in which they think, but still should be tolerated by each other and listened to and considered as something that will actually give us fulfillment by knowing what the other side is. And so he talks about this in the course of, 95 pages, but I recommend it strongly to all. The simple fact that it can be condensed and put into a page is one thing, or spoken in a few sentences, but it's another to sit and read it and think about it as we go, is how much each of us has to grow. We have to see that the distance that we have between people does not continue to exist. And we think about this in areas especially where we are having policy today. How do we make it that everyone, what is, in our state, in our local government, in our country, everyone has proper and accessible health? And then when we suddenly say, but health is a natural right. It belongs to all people. It belongs to the billions that are outside of our country and who right now have no access to modern health. Why shouldn't they? And you say, well, it would cost a fortune. It would not cost as much as our military expenses of $1.5 trillion a year. It would not cost that much. And it would give far greater security than what the military mights of the world do today. And so looked at that way, there are resources available that are there for the taking. There are resources that we could use if redirected and redistributed to where people could have access to, food security, enough to eat, water, proper use of water, lodging. Many people live in very poor housing, and about health and education, and we can go on and on. These are what makes a neighborhood. Their neighborhoods are not made by saying this little group lives over here in a rich area and it's a gated community. Others live outside it, and they have to live the way they do because they didn't have the opportunity, the chance, or maybe the talent to get into a position where they could be greater than others. We have to begin to see neighborhoods are things that must all be peaceful, and peace will come through equality. And as we begin to look at it that way, then to love God by loving our neighbor becomes a task that we all have to look at very carefully. Do we have people that we exclude from our lives? If we do, we've got to look into how we can change. And that brings us to the final application. Can we, in some way, as a people, see that every good deed we do is a vital force that changes the world in which we live? Every bad deed does the opposite, of course, but we can do good deeds. We're capable of it, and especially in times of pandemic, when some people do not have access to the food or something else that they need very desperately, it's our job to be of kindness and friendship to them and to help them in some way. Each little deed that we do grows in a world in which we all need to form a greater neighborhood. And so all the deeds that we do that are good add to the fullness of what needs to be done. We have to think both globally, and that is that neighborhood over on the other side of the world in China or the Philippines is our neighborhood. And we also have to look locally and look out for those around us who need our help. It's important for us to see both and to be able to balance them in our life. Then we can balance the fact that we have two great commandments, loving God and loving neighbor, and that we obey and follow the first by being very helpful in the second. Think about these things. It's very important, especially in these troubled times.
Morning has broken like the first morning. Blackbird has spoken